Any rate, welcome to Grand Rounds. I just wanted to mention that next week our speaker is going to be Dr. Renee Kahn, who is the new chair of psychiatry at Mount Sinai. And Renee is really a longtime friend and colleague who is Dutch by origin and was the chair at the University of Utrecht. And this is interesting, Darren, you may appreciate this. In Europe, there is still a policy in most companies and academics of mandatory retirement at 65, despite the fact that people are just spring chickens at that age nowadays. And Renee reached the age of 65 and had to retire and was offered a chair at Mount Sinai, so he came here for his next career. But he's a noted schizophrenia researcher and will be very interesting to hear. After that, we have one more Grand Rounds, and then we'll recess for August. So today we have really a special Grand Rounds presentation, not just in terms of the guest speaker, but in terms of the format that we're going to have, which will be more as a dialogue. And we were able to arrange for the attendance of a much sought-after individual with a prominent bio and important position in American society, Darren Walker, who's president of the Ford Foundation, as a result of his relatively newly found but growing interest in mental health care and biomedical research, and his relationship with one of our distinguished faculty, Anke Ehrhard, who has known him and been involved with the Ford Foundation as well as other organizations for a number of years. So I was thinking about how to introduce him, and I was kind of given like a brief paragraph, but I just sort of went to the internet, and I don't know who composed your Wikipedia page, but I thought it would be perfect. So would you mind if I just quoted some of it? It's open source, but for whatever reason, none of your critics could say anything bad about you. So Darren Walker is a nonprofit executive who serves as president of the Ford Foundation. Earlier in his career, he worked as an attorney and an investment banker, and he serves in a number of other capacities currently. But what really struck me is his history. So Mr. Walker was born in a charity hospital in Lafayette, Louisiana, raised by a single mother in Ames and later Goose Creek, Texas, and was one of the country's first children to benefit from the Head Start program. He was educated in public schools, but with financial support from a Pell Grant, was admitted to the University of Texas, where he graduated from, and then also went on to get a law degree at the University of Texas. He began his career in international law at the firm of Cleary Gottlieb, and then joined UBS in the investment banking division, capital markets. But in 1995, he left the private sector, corporate world, and spent a year volunteering at the Harlem school system, and then went on to become the chief operating officer at the Abyssinian Development Corporation, a community development organization located in Harlem. And there he was able to draw on his private sector experience to advance the revitalization of various community activities and services in Harlem, including the opening of supermarkets and other types of essential businesses. I guess that's called microenvironment or microeconomics. He also led the development of the first public school built in New York City by a community organization. From 2002 to 2010, he was vice president for foundation initiatives at Rockefeller Foundation. At Rockefeller, he led a recovery program in the southern part of the country in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And in 2010, he was recruited and appointed to the role of Vice President for Education, Creativity, and Expression at the Ford Foundation, and then in 2013 was made the President of the Ford Foundation. So in that role of such a large and prominent nonprofit organization, he has a very important role, platform, and legacy to live up to and to continue. And in terms of trying to match people in terms of the path they've traversed to the role they're going to assume, he certainly has one of the most interesting ones. And the final thing I'll say is that I think having him here as the head of arguably the largest foundation, or one of the largest private nonprofit foundations in the world exemplifies whatever we say about the United States and the problems that it has and so forth and so on. Its tradition of philanthropy is like no other place. And given what's happened in recent years with respect to healthcare financing and biomedical research funding, if it wasn't for philanthropic organizations and support, I just don't know where we would be. So I have no idea what they're going to talk about, but I know it's going to be interesting and look forward to it. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Darren Walker.
So welcome, Darren, and thank you very much for doing this. So you and I met in 2010 when I was on the board of trustees at the Ford Foundation. We actually worked together because I was assigned to your committee as a trustee. And then I rotated off after my time was over, and you, 3 years later, became the president. So, and we have stayed in touch. So I wanted to start with the following. You, as a president, over the last 3 years, have really focused on the growing inequality worldwide. And you and your colleagues at the foundation discussed widely how that could have an impact. And after much exploration, you decided that you could do best was to focus on the drivers of inequality in the US and around the world, since Ford has a number of offices around the world. But I want to particularly focus on the US. So you with the foundation went through a rigorous process to arrive at an understanding of what is driving inequality and how the foundation might have an impact on the injustice of inequality. And essentially, and reading about all of that, you came up with a very interesting template, which provides a way of looking at inequality and provides some guidance on how to deal with it. So I wonder whether you could briefly describe some of the principles of such a template and your vision of some of the drivers of inequality in our society.
Well, thank you, Anka, and good morning, everyone. I'm honored that so many people in the middle of the summer would turn up to hear me talk. And thank you, Jeffrey, for that kind introduction. And Anka, we miss you desperately at the Ford Foundation. And the fact that you had served your term and could not be renewed because of our bylaws of term limits.
From 6 years to
Yes,
5
but
years,
you couldn't be renewed again. That was, and so we miss you. And so I'm happy to have a chance to be with you and talk, even if it is rather strange. I mean, it's not intimate, although I think we should try to make it intimate, right? Okay. So I think the question first, I am so grateful to have the opportunity that I have to be president of the Ford Foundation. And I think if people know the history of the Ford Foundation and the history of Henry Ford himself, the choice of a queer Black man is probably not something that would be normative in terms of me being president of the Ford Foundation. But I think it does, as Jeffrey said, speak to the unique value proposition of philanthropy in American society and in the world. Inequality, as we see it, is one of the greatest threats in the world. And the process that you reference is a process that we undertook in a very sort of McKinseyan fashion of, as the new president, I looked at our mission. Our mission is to promote democracy, reduce poverty and injustice in the world. And so we went about asking questions about what are the threats to democracy, democratic practice, peace, and security in the world. And there were three primary challenges. One and the existential one is climate change. Another was the challenge of large pandemics and huge medical and public health challenges. And the third was inequality, was growing inequality, the chasm between those who are advantaged and those who are disadvantaged in societies. And so as we looked at assessing our comparative advantage, as the consultants call it, as we looked at our assets, our networks, our legacy, what we have to invest towards those three global threats, we decided that inequality was the one. So we're not a science foundation like Gates or Hewlett. We don't have climate scientists. What we have are a lot of lawyers, a lot of people working with experience in human rights, and people working on economic development. But we are a social justice philanthropy. And philanthropy is not necessarily about justice, and we have to be really clear about that. Justice requires an interrogation of privilege, and most people and institutions with privilege actually don't like to be interrogated. We're actually quite comfortable with our privilege, and wealthy people who are in positions of power and authority and influence actually are usually pretty comfortable with that. Justice requires that we be introspective about that privilege. And if social justice philanthropy is a particular kind of philanthropy that is not engaged in a charitable exercise. It's engaged in a serious inquiry of root causes. And so when we looked at the root causes of growing inequality, which is a global trend, whether you're in China or India or Brazil or the United States, inequality is a huge issue. And that is not to say that we have not made tremendous progress in poverty reduction in countries like China, for example. However, the threat that is posed in a democracy such as the United States by the trend of inequality is profound. Because in the United States, especially, our notions, our narrative of who we are as a people has opportunity at the center of that. And opportunity and inequality correlate. The more inequality there is in a society, the less opportunity there is. And so as we looked at those drivers, what we found was interesting was the response, the gap in the response between experts, economists, technologists, about what was driving inequality. They were highly technical. They were economics, globalization, automation, AI, technology, robotics, all of these things. When you talk to people in communities, it was all culture. It was what's driving inequality in my community is that I am a woman, a young girl, and we are not valued. So regardless of what is happening in our larger trends, we have the root cause of this is the fact that we are not valued. The root cause of a significant part of the inequality in the United States is a vestige of our history of slavery. And that the root cause of that, of our criminal justice system, is absolutely rooted in that reality that is part of the American narrative. And so we have to engage in very difficult work to unearth and acknowledge the implications for growing inequality today in these historical legacy issues in the United States, for example, that we have simply been unable or unwilling to examine because we do believe in opportunity and we do wish to be colorblind, in spite of the fact that colorblindness only reinforces inequality, because colorblindness allows us to say that whatever happened in the past happened. Let's just start today being colorblind. And as opposed to internalizing an understanding of how what is happening today is a result of a historical underpinning of cultural practice, normative standards, and our ideas about a hierarchy that may never have been fully articulated, but that has absolutely been present in every generation. And it's a hierarchy, a racialized hierarchy. And that racialized hierarchy remains with us today. So when we look at those drivers are cultural, they are political, a community of people, a country of people feeling more alienated from their political system and believing that the political system is actually rigged. Meaning we know from the Pew studies that more and more Americans believe that. An economy that works for fewer Americans, and we know that in fact that is true too. I mean, wages have been stagnant for working people. And those of us, and I include us, certainly me, among the most privileged, have been hugely advantaged. And our advantage has the compounding effect, right? So in our society, if you are advantaged, your advantage is actually compounded by you're just parking your money. I mean, and your disadvantage is also compounded. And so what we have to do if we are to actually address the drivers is to disrupt those drivers, to think about interventions that in the area of education, for example, where there is no system more unequal in our society than our education system, really ask fundamental questions and fund litigation, advocacy, public education, to name, frame, surface the issues in a way that looks at these issues through inequality and our values for opportunity, and ask America, is this the country we want? Is this the country we want that produces extraordinary advantage for some and their children in an educational system, and extraordinary disadvantage that is compounded in an educational system for poor people, for Blacks and Latinos? And finally, I will say that inequality matters in our society because inequality and hope also correlate. And America has always been a hopeful society. And the greatest threat to America is not terrorism or a pandemic. It is hopelessness, because hopelessness will drive a people to do desperate things because they do not believe that the status quo is worth believing in anymore. And so the most outrageous and outlandish things that those of us like you and me who live with privilege and who say, why are those people in Kansas doing the things they're doing, voting against their interests? They don't think they're voting against their interests because they see people like you and me as being advantaged by this system, because we are advantaged by this system. And they realize that they are increasingly left behind and that our economy is producing fewer winners and more losers. And what is different about America today, and why our work at the foundation is so focused on inequality, is because inequality has broadened the aperture of who is left behind in this country. And we in this country, whether it is right or wrong, for generations our democracy has had the elasticity to absorb generations of poor Black people, of poor immigrants, of Native Americans on reservations, and the genocide that their community experienced. Our democracy does not have the elasticity to absorb a generation of downwardly mobile white people. And that is a reality, and it is not polite to say it, but it is a reality, and I think in this country we have to be able to deal with reality.
Well, that's very interesting. Now, the principles, and I made myself familiar with the principles at Ford of inequality and the drivers. So if you were bringing it closer to home, if you were to develop a template that would aid an institution like ours, like in higher education, university, a medical school, to deal with the challenges of inequality, especially if your goal is a lasting effect on changing the culture. So what might such a template look like?
Well, first of all, I think the work that you do is critical to building a more just society. Right? There is, along with the education system, the health system is an essential provider of opportunity, and inequality is both a cause and a symptom, and you see it manifest in our health systems, of course. So I think that one of the real challenges for medical institutions, for research institutions, is that you exist in this highly regulated, highly increasingly politicized sector, where your work is more essential than ever, and yet it is also more contested. And so that's the problem. So I want to get to how we get at that, but that's how I see the challenge. So a way forward has to be that leadership of these institutions and all of you must be engaged in action. And I think often what has happened is that institutions in our democracy have presumed that because we are working in the public interest, that the public will fully understand, appreciate, and support our work and our sector. And I think we have to come to grips with the fact that the very notion of justice, which is what you all have all committed your careers to, the very idea of justice is contested. And therefore, your work is contested. And I don't mean to make this oppositional or try to turn you all into a group of activists. I mean, look at me. I hardly look like an activist sitting here. But I do believe that there has to be more engagement with the public. Institutions like yours, which have prestige, which have influence, which have power, have to be engaged in the public interest frontally. I mean, talking about the public interest, articulating your mission and what you do as critical to our democracy and critical to our values as an American institution. And so, I mean, part of it is about leadership. I don't know how else to and I know we have great leaders, and I'm seeing one with the microphone, so Jeffrey, you go.
This isn't a question. This is just we have gotten that we can't sit in our ivory tower doing the traditional clinical care education research missions, that there needs to be this activism or this outward reaching. But in terms of informing public, the government, the critical interlocutor is the media. And the media is tone deaf or disinterested. That's what our experience has been.
So I think it's really interesting that you say that. If you want to talk about media, I think legacy institutions feel neglected by the media. Don't buy it, because legacy institutions think about legacy media. And so you think about, well, what has the New York Times written about us? What was on CNN about us? The great thing about media today is that those institutions remain vital and hugely important. But there is a way you work around those institutions and you get your message out. But you've got to think about it very differently. And I went through this with my own institution because of the Ford Foundation, we took the stance, well, we just do good work in the public interest. Why do we need a communications office? We've never had a communications office. We've never had anyone working on social media. Why? We do good work for the world. Well, that's a really naive and arrogant position to take, that, you know, we do good work. Actually, we are public institutions. We must tell our stories. And we don't necessarily need the New York Times to tell our story. And so part of it is investing in a communication strategy that is not normative for legacies. Because this is, Ford Foundation and Columbia and, all of us suffer from thinking about things in a normative way. We have to disrupt our thinking about how we get our message out, how we speak to the public, how we engage with the community. The normative ways are not that relevant anymore. And I see it in my own work at Ford. I see the way in which, we thought about things in that narrow way, and now that we, have invested, and it takes money. And don't get me wrong, I've had people say to me, well, why are you spending, this amount of money on social media? Because we have an obligation to tell our story, and social media is the most effective way to do that. And so, yes, I spend my time tweeting. Is that really like the best? Actually, it is a very good use of my time. And the influence that comes from being connected to communities, I have seen it reverberate back. I've had a senator say to me, my staff told me that, showed me that silly thing I did on YouTube about dancing and things. They've seen all sorts of things, and that was made possible only because of social media. So I don't want to minimize, Jeffrey, your challenge, because you are absolutely right, it's a huge challenge, and the traditional media is absolutely tone deaf, and they're not going to take it up.
I'd like to. So the way we are going to do this in general is I have a few questions, and then we want to open it up, of course, to the public. So I like to move on to diversity, in particular in terms of efforts to enroll and accommodate diverse students, diverse faculty, again, at our own landscape here. How can we change in our thinking, in our methods to have lasting success? Because it's a challenge. And I keep in mind your template, attract, accommodate, and maintain. So what would you say if you were in charge? How would you make sure to get student body, faculty, et cetera, diverse and have an impact?
Well, I think that it is about being actually authentically committed to the idea that diversity is about excellence, because the way issues are framed has profound implications for how people see themselves engaging on the issue. And unfortunately, diversity has been framed by some as antithetical to excellence. And we know that is actually not true. There is empirical evidence. So, and yet it remains. And it remains in part because many of those most ardent foes of diversity speak from a platform of privilege that they seek to protect. And I understand that. I absolutely understand that. And that this isn't a political statement, because I got into a big argument the other day with a friend who's, a progressive who, is disagreed with something I wrote about legacy admissions and how in a society like America, the fact that your grandfather went to Yale should have anything to do with why you are in any part of deliberations about your admissions, to me, is anti-democratic. I mean, it has, and yet this person said, oh, but we can't do away with legacy. I mean, I like the fact that my grandfather went to Yale, and I want my kid to go to Yale, and now, it's a legacy of privilege. And so diversity, in part, bumps up against the very system of privilege that we have. And what is interesting about the debate is that it is framed as letting in lesser qualified people and thereby diminishing our excellence. I think we have to be really clear about what is excellence, right? And so I think the role for leadership is to define excellence, because I don't believe that in a society like America, excellence can be defined without diversity. I mean, because particularly for public institutions, because our currency is the trust that we have, the legitimacy we have with the public. And if the public looks at our institutions and does not see itself, or sees only a privileged part of the public reflected, our legitimacy with the very institution, the very people we need to sustain our institutions, over time is diminished. And so we have to be mindful of that. And so we have to be authentically seeking that. And if we are not authentic, people see through it. And if it's a check the box, we've got to do this attitude from leadership, then that permeates the whole institution. So I believe that we have to be authentically interested in recruitment, that we have to be committed to retention and success, and that in turn will generate alumni who feel loyal and who want to reinvest in helping the institution become more diverse. Because part of the real barrier is acknowledging that an institution isn't diverse. And when you do that, you then have to say, oh, so what do we really need to do to attract and retain and sustain the kind of both enrollment, the diversity of faculty, all of these things take a lot of thought. And this is why it's really hard. When I get back, I always come back to the statement about, fairness for privileged people to us sometimes feels like oppression, because it's like, really? I mean, I've got to do this now to when it used to just be so easy, I could call my friend, or I could just open an RFP, or I could just, and now you've got me, I've got to do this and do, really? It's such a hassle. It's it's just less convenient for me. And I really don't like that. And I think that's part of the sort of when we hear oh, diversity, that's part of what this is about. Is that today, whether we like it or not, we are the generations, because I'm I'm looking here, I mean, definitely not, generations who must at once come to grips with reconciling our history with today. And that does put an absolute greater burden. There is no doubt that the burden on leadership today is far greater than it was a generation ago when we had primarily white men in charge of everything and a few elite institutions having really an inordinate amount of power in a society. And so, yeah, it's more of a burden. But if you're actually committed, you should be excited about the work.
So along those lines, what has changed in terms of racism since you were a kid?
So what has changed? Much has changed. So I think that I was very lucky to be in the first class of Head Start in 1965. And I think that Head Start, I mean, which I'm always excited to talk about because it was the Ford Foundation pilot at Yale that created Head Start. But there were, for my generation of African Americans, Latinos, but particularly poor blacks like me growing up, there really was a sense of our society believing in our potential, and that all along my journey, I felt like I was being cheered on. Right? I felt like, my public schools. I mean, I never went to a private school or anything, but I went to good public schools. And I attended a great public university, and I had a wonderful scholarship. And the irony, of course, is that the scholarship was created by a nice Texas oil man who wanted young, white, Gentile Texas boys to come to Austin and be educated. And again, only in America, right? And so there are thousands of stories like mine. I mean, thousands of stories like mine. And so in no way is my story unique for my generation. But what has changed is the systemic ways in which Black and brown people, and increasingly immigrants, have been systematically otherized in really otherized in really profound ways that manifest in our systems, starting with our criminal justice system. I mean, there is no doubt that what has changed is, from when I was a young boy, is the fact that we as a nation created and designed a criminal justice system with the intent of criminalizing hundreds of thousands, millions now, of Black and brown, primarily men. That in fact, it was designed with that. And if you read John Ehrlichman's interview with the Atlanta Constitutional Journal when he got out of prison and he talked about the beginnings of the war on drugs with Richard Nixon, they literally talked about this will marginalize the Blacks who are our opposition. And they were right, because every successive administration, Republican and Democrat, piled on the war on drugs and promulgated a set of laws that have rendered millions of people marginalized to our economy and to their communities. And the implication, therefore, writ large for opportunity and justice has just been profound. And so the data point that 1 in 3 Black men have some engagement in the criminal justice system, not that they're in prison, but they have some engagement with the system. I mean, that would have just been antithetical when I was growing up. And so when we look at every system, we see both the degrading of the public system, which has been a part of this, right? So the public has been degraded in our society, whether it is public housing, public education, public parks. I mean, if it has public in front of it, we have allowed that system to be degraded when that system is essential to a functioning democracy, particularly a functioning democracy that is built on the notion of opportunity. So we can't say that we have a public higher education system that is an equalizer, as I experienced recently with a person who disagreed with me on some things on a panel, who said, education is the great equalizer and it's not, inequality isn't, okay. But you can't say public education is the great equalizer and then advocate for the privatization of the student loan program, which automatically will drive costs up for students who are poor and low income, who we want to get on the mobility escalator. You can't reconcile that.
I can't, I have an impulse control problem listening to you talk. And
I do that to people, Jeffrey.
But so I agree that the public, has become kind of an epithet or a term, a code term that has this negative connotation. But it wasn't always that way. I mean, I went to public schools too. And I think the reason it's taken on that negative connotation has to do because it's equated with government. And that if you let the government run things, they don't work. Therefore, they have to be non-government, non-public. And that's a more recent phenomenon. So the question is why has our government failed to sustain these institutions? I mean, you can either answer that or just hear it as a rhetorical comment, but I just wanted to add that.
No, and just to be clear, I was answering the question, what's changed? And what has changed is that the public has been degraded, and what, to my mind, then is that government, the idea of the role of government, because those public institutions are a function of government. And so we have allowed and bought into this idea that government is inept. Government is us. I mean, we want public housing to function because we actually want there to be decent, affordable housing for people. I think, and so the circularity of the challenge of just like looking, as you said, public housing, of how it's moved from when Lloyd Blankfein, the chairman of Goldman Sachs, lived in public housing in East New York, to a set of policies that in some ways were well-intended, but had damaging consequences. So when Lloyd Blankfein lived in public housing, there wasn't a rule that you had to be low income to live in public housing. But as the supply of affordable housing for poor people became less and less, more and more moved into public housing, right? And so on the one hand, government is doing the right thing by saying, actually, this scarce resource should go to the poorest and most vulnerable Americans. And yet, by warehousing them, and in a city like Chicago, which had a public housing system that was designed to put all of the blacks on the south side of the city and leave the North Shore for whites, rendered that outcome then of government being seen as inept. It wasn't, the design of that was the will of the people of Chicago. That's what they wanted. And so this is my point about coming to grips with our history and reconciling these narratives that say, oh, isn't government inept? Look at what they did in Chicago. They can't even run a decent housing authority. The housing authority in Chicago was destined to fail because it was set up based on a racist system of geography in that city. And so to blame government for it. And the narrative then, of course, over time to be that government can't run public housing. So we will end, as happened during the Reagan administration, we will simply say government is prohibited because government is so inept that they are prohibited from building any sort of housing. And we turn it over to the private sector. So I agree with you, Jeffrey. It's why we talk about the role of government in a very not defensive way. I mean, we actually proudly believe that in a democracy, particularly a democracy with growing inequality, that government has to be robust. And government has a role to play because simply saying, for example, as I was confronted with at a recent conversation, inequality isn't the problem. Inequality will be solved if government just gets out of the way and lets the markets and the economy grow. There is a very strong point of view about that in society, that actually the problem that I have, this meta challenge, can be solved if we just grow the economy. We know that actually that's not true because the economy has grown the last 30 years pretty consistently 2 to 3 GDP every year. And yet inequality has grown too. So how did we construct an economy that produces these bad outcomes? We can't simply say we need to grow the economy and let government get out of the way. I don't agree with that.
Maybe one more question, and then we open it up more closer to my own home. So the federal government is threatening to cut back in funding certain areas of sexuality and gender. Sexuality and gender. The reasons for these cutbacks vary. Some are religious, others are ignorance, some are racist, some are sexist. And do you expect any coordinated efforts by private foundations to fill this gap?
Well, I absolutely think that a role of private foundations is to position issues that are difficult to talk about as a critical issue for society to talk about, right? And so these issues that you raise and that you spent your career working on remain at the core of why we have growing inequality. And so I do see among a group of foundations work to elevate both the problem, and frame the problem in the right way, as we are seeing. So much of this is about the way an issue gets framed. It's one of those things, Jeffrey, that we have learned about communications, is that we assume that an issue is going to be framed in the right way. Actually, issues get framed in ways that are very harmful. We believe that we need a tax policy, and that tax policy, part of the fairness of it is an estate tax. Well, guess what? Others have framed that as a death tax. Boy, a death tax sounds pretty awful, doesn't it? So we have to get better at talking about how these public issues and things like racism and sexism and gender bias, we have to talk about that. And so yes, foundations, I think, increasingly see this area, and you see foundations like Ford and Open Society and Hewlett and even Gates. I think Melinda has been out front talking more about gender bias that's built into our systems than she was, say, 10 years ago when they were just starting. So I do believe that philanthropy has a critical role.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now going to open it up to questions, and our chief residents will do the microphones. So.
Hi,
Okay.
I'm Geraldine Downer
Yes.
from the Centre for Justice and also the Psychology Department. And I'm very interested to hear from you what the Ford Foundation is doing in the area of mass incarceration. Because as you pointed out, that's probably the single most prominent indicator of inequality in the US, at least. And also, we've been as a university, thinking and talking a lot about what Columbia can do, perhaps in partnership with other universities, in playing our role in ending mass incarceration?
Great question. I think I'll just briefly say that for us, criminal justice reform is a major program, and in terms of my own time spent among all of our programs, it's one that I spend a lot of time on. We have a program that supports, we spend about $20 to $25 million a year on criminal justice reform. And we work at the state level because, as you know, most prisoners in this country are not in federal prisons. They're in state penitentiaries and county and city jails. And so our grantees, who are some of the leading organizations working in this area, are working on a number of interventions towards the objective of reducing by 30% the number of people in prison in this country by 2020. And those include efforts such as ending cash bail. We know that if we ended cash bail, we have a bail system in this country that is a for-profit enterprise that seeks to profit off of the misery of poor people who can't post $500 bail. And so there's an entire industry, multi-billion dollar industry across this country that organizations we have supported are actually taking on. And with increasing success, we now are up to 8 states, including New Jersey, which recently ended cash bail. By simply ending cash bail, the number of poor people who will be incarcerated, depending on the state, will be reduced from 10 to 20%. Because in most states, the county jails are huge repositories, right? So that is just one example, but we could go from the continuum from juvenile justice issues, which is just a huge challenge, all the way to reentry and jobs and employment and housing, where our grantees are working. I do think there's a role for universities to play, because the imprimatur of prestigious universities like yours on this issue signals it as a public issue that is not about a punitive sort of justice system. It is actually about restorative, rehabilitative justice. And you and institutions like this can play a huge role. And so that ranges from, the issue of mental health. The number one issue. You talk to any lawyer, any activist engaged who goes to prisons. I was on the commission on the future of Rikers Island, and the degree of mental health challenge among imprisoned men and women, in some jails is 75%. So the role that you could play, both in service provision, but more importantly, I believe, in policy and the ways in which our systems, because our prisons have become a mental health system in some ways. And so how can you think about, because actually the lawyers we support can't fix this problem, right? We can't fix this problem without mental health professionals engaged centrally, not peripherally, to the problem.
So you should know, I don't know whether they're here, that we have 2 people and their teams who are working on that. One is Gail Wasserman in Child Psychiatry. Gail, are you here? She may not be here. And one is in my own division, Kate Elkington. Both of them work very closely with juvenile kids who are on probation, and have models in how to make sure there's a huge relapse, of course, if there is no intervention. So both of them have, for years, worked on finding new models, and with good success, that there's not as much relapse to just go back to prison.
Can I just inject something again? I'm sorry, I'm speaking too much, but it's a great opportunity. The issue of mental health and criminal justice is greatly intertwined and getting even more so. The roots of the criminal justice system becoming a mental health system began with deinstitutionalization, which was a good thing, but led to an unintended outcome. There are ways to try and address this thing, but they're not being pursued in any systematic or extensive way. Two quick examples. If you look at adult prisons, 30 to 40% are inmates who have some mental disorder, and it may or may not have played a role in committing crime and getting them locked up. If you look at juvenile prisons, about 40% of the inmates are kids that have learning disabilities. And their learning disabilities in mainstream schools prove to be difficult, and in frustration, they often turn to antisocial behaviors which get them into trouble. There's no facilities in most hospitals and no resources to support at most places screening and treatment for pediatric learning disabilities. We had a donor. This was a fashion designer who, with her affluence and a family history, supported something called the Promise Project, Dana Buckman, and she's been supporting for the past now 6 years a program where in our children's hospital we do screening of Harlem, Washington Heights, Inwood youth for this and provide them with care, which probably has a diversion of what the unintended sequelae might be. Second thing, Governor Cuomo, I don't want to speak badly, but it probably is motivated out of good sense as well as political reasons, directed us recently, and Anka was involved in this. You should talk about this, Anka. The providing of care for incarcerated transgender.
Yes, both Walter and I were approached because we would have the expertise to make sure that transgender people in prison would get mental health care, would have access to hormones, and even they were talking about surgery. But then it always, to pull something like this off takes resources, and they want to do it on the cheap, which you can't do. And both Walter and I said we are only going to do this if we have the resources to do it, because it's complicated. But there are transgender, how many, 280 in the state of New York are in prisons. Known, yes, yes, known, 280 or so.
So how many times does the governor pick up the phone and call you, or his office? Not a lot, but in this case, they called, they said, design us a program to provide care to these individuals, and Anka, Walter, Dave Lowenthal met for over a period of months, designed a program, presented it, and we said, oh, we're in, they're going to fund this, and we're going to do something that's innovative and new. And then, oh, it's on hold. And then the next thing is, okay, we want to do it, and you've got to do it by September. And by the way, we don't have any money. You have to find a way to do it anyway.
Welcome to. I think that's right. But I think one of the things, and so the frustration is understandably palpable. And however, there is a lesson there for me. I think somebody should be writing and documenting this. I'm sure you are, but on some level, how do you take this experience and put it in the public domain and say, here's an opportunity to fix this major challenge we have with transgender imprisoned. There is a role for institutions, and you all are purveyors of knowledge. And so the ability to say, here's what a system would look like. Here's how we could design something. And which legislator is going to get behind? Because I would bet that there would be someone in the legislature who would be interested in taking up this, or at least saying to the committee that oversees mental health and public facilities, let's have a hearing on this. You guys go up to Albany and testify on. I don't know. I'm just saying in terms of the way in which the cutting edge things that you do and your capabilities here to solve these issues of mental health. And Jeff is right about the history, but the history is this is why democracy is so challenging, because deinstitutionalization was meant as an initial policy intervention, which was to be followed by the building of halfway houses and community-based support facilities for these people. And we know that actually what prevented that from happening were local communities, right? It's the same thing. So we just with Rikers recommended closing Rikers in 10 years. Of course, one of the reasons the mayor didn't get behind this initially, he did ultimately, but again, welcome to politics, is because he doesn't want in the middle of an election year to have people in communities saying, what's going to happen to all those people in Rikers? You better not send them to my neighborhood, right? So this is the challenge of democracy. This is that we are our own enemies. We possess the potential to solve the problem, but we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
Other questions?
Yes, I wonder if you could say something about investing and social justice bonds, because you can get the politicians or you get the bankers, and the bankers have the power to do that. Could you say something about those two issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually just spoke at a conference with, you probably know Sir Ronald Cohen, who is the inventor of the social impact bond in London, in Chicago on Monday. And this is a mechanism by which the service provision, let's just say in a prison system of reducing recidivism, is funded by a group of investors. And if the intervention is successful and the cohort of prisoners do not go back to prison within 3 years, obviously whatever the agreed upon, then the investors are paid back, and the government, because the government is saving money, right, pays the investors. So it is, in fact, a very innovative and interesting idea that we have supported at the foundation in terms of some innovations, because we've got to solve this, and we've got to look for every way that we can through public-private partnership, et cetera. So that there are now about 52, 53 SIBs, the social impact bonds, SIBs in the U.S. The UK has been the leader. They've got, I think, well over 100 at this point. But they are proving to be a very interesting intervention and way of financing some innovative programs, right? So interventions around mental health, for example. So there are ways, as long as you are clear about the metric for success, the investors then know if they're going to be paid back or not. And government then basically signs a contract with a group of investors. It's a really interesting idea. The issue of, as you say, sir, our endowment investing, which is another issue that I have used my bully pulpit for, which is that we foundations have billions of dollars in our investments, and we generally haven't used those dollars for any social impact. And I actually believe that we should affirmatively be doing that. It is the Treasury and the IRS allow us to do that with our investments, and yet most foundations don't. And I think that this, again, is a way in which we can use our endowment investment to do innovative social impact work. So we have to use all of the assets in our sort of aperture, and we aren't doing it. I mean, so Ford, we just announced that we would put $1 billion of our $12.5 billion into a fund that would invest in mission related investments. Yes, sir. So one way in which we could do that would be to take some part of that and invest in a SIB.
I want to ask you about healthcare, since we're a medical school. Is there any model internationally that you know of where universal healthcare coverage has worked without a single payer system?
No, I'm not an expert, but I have certainly from my time at Rockefeller, where I did have some insight into public health. Um, I don't know of a system that is not a single payer system where it has worked. I
So
guess
that is- that-
that leads to the question of about our own system, but
Yes, so that would actually raises the question. There doesn't seem to be any major voice in the US that places a single payer system at the core of its case.
no, sir, that is there actually was a voice. I mean, during the
Harry Truman.
no. I mean, actually, during the initial negotiations around ACA, there was a small group who said, and in fact, Senator Sanders has talked about this. That actually there was a group, Barbara Lee, the congresswoman from San Francisco. I mean, I remember a number of people in Congress who said we should have a single payer system, and of course, I mean, to me, I can't imagine a better system than a single payer system. However, again, we keep coming back to politics. I mean, my understanding, I was not involved, obviously, is that in order to get the private sector to agree to endorse Obamacare, certain concessions were made, and that this was one of those concessions. And so, again, that's our system. I think you are seeing, however, now, even some people still talking about why don't we have a single payer system? And again, it is for those people who are truly knowledgeable about these issues and can get over the rhetoric, right? I mean, this rhetoric that, oh my God, we're going to have. I mean, I'm from Texas, and I have a friend in Texas who married a Brit, and her father, before she was having her baby, said, you have to come back to Texas, to Dallas, and have your baby because you can't have your baby in that socialist system in the UK. I mean, the level of ignorance. I mean, and so she said, are you kidding? I have never had better health care than I've had here in London. And, this includes the, fancy system that you're paying privately for back in Dallas. And so there are these narratives that get framed, and this again is why framing is so important. These issues get framed in a way that we then can't get out from under. And so this idea that single payer is going to mean, death panels and widespread rationing of the most basic health services has caught on with some parts of our society, which defeats the very thing that actually would help most people in our society in terms of health.
Well, I think that the most striking thing is the fact that single pay and all of the discussion and legislative interaction about healthcare financing, that single payer is not mentioned as much as you would think. But the reason for that is just as you said, and is very obvious, which is that somebody once said that trying to come up with a healthcare legislation in this country is sort of akin to trying to thread the eye of a needle with a camel. But it's running a gauntlet of special interests with the insurance companies, the hospitals, the doctors, like it's DOA. So in 1990s, when the Clinton administration was trying to do something comprehensive and so-called and hopefully enlightened, the Harry and Louise thing nuked it before it even could. So it's the special interest will not permit and the framing you talk about is just part of the ways to undermine the discussion and prevent getting into it. But I don't know, John, did you have a system you would point to?
I guess you noticed I had an accent, but that's Australian. So in Australia, there's basically a single payer system, and the healthcare is, certainly comparable to here at the higher end. and everybody has healthcare, and Scandinavia and England and a lot of countries. I'm describing this as a technocrat rather than ideologically. There isn't an example that I'm aware of where it works without a single payer system, that every citizen has a basic health care. So in the absence of a model, we have to think very hard about, the realistic, it is not a realistic goal without that system. And therefore, what are we really advocating for? Healthcare for the haves versus the have-nots, which seems to be antithetical to the objectives of the Ford Foundation
Well, it is antithetical.
and
but
many of us.
Absolutely, and institutions like this, of course, is antithetical. I think again, there are we can be encouraged. So, for example, the Medicaid expansion at the states is basically expanding a single payer system, right? I mean, and so the fact that we got Republican governors to take up expanding healthcare through a single payer system to an increasing number of their population is a good thing. And there are so just this one point about framing, and my friend Risa Lavizzo Murray, who was the president of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for years, one of the things that they did that I thought was so brilliant was to frame the idea of the right to health. Because in the United States, actually, unlike in Australia and the Nordics and the UK, actually, we haven't believed that you actually have a right to health. You had a right to pay for an insurance company to, but actually, when you polled people, and this is one of the things why the Clintons, another reason why was because people actually, the population, Americans weren't necessarily bought into the idea that every American has a right to health. Now, when Pew, the Pew study about how people see themselves in terms of healthcare, overwhelmingly now Americans see that the idea that right to health is a deep right that everyone should have. So if we believe that, if it's been reframed that way, then now we actually have a chance. Now it's going to take years, but that's a radical idea. I know to an Australian it sounds like it's not radical at all, but to an American sensibility from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, the idea that a right to health was moving to that is huge.
But then the question that follows, to get around the ideological objections, the special interests, is how much do you want to spend of it? Is it 5% of your GDP or 20% of your GDP? And that leads to rationing and waiting, and all solvable, but that's the next.
Thanks for a very thought-provoking and thoughtful talk. I wanted to raise an issue that you alluded to and bring a psychological dimension to it. We are in a psychiatry department, after all. And that was when you said that it would be very difficult for this country to absorb a downwardly mobile, white, let's say, lower middle class, for instance. And that reminded me of a profound essay that Richard Hofstadter wrote probably about 50 years ago on the paranoid style in American politics. And he felt that there was a significant group of individuals in this country who could become activated in a paranoid way by certain political leaders and economic forces. And as most people in this room know, a paranoid style is really a whole nexus of beliefs. It's not just about conspiracy theories, but it's about anti-intellectualism, xenophobia, anti-scientificism. So if you accept that there is a group of people in this country who vote against their self-interest, not because, as you brilliantly pointed out, they don't view it that way. They're voting their ideology, and their ideology may, to an outsider, look paranoid. Is there a way to address this at an institutional level without getting into pejorative psychiatric name calling, as in, hey, you're paranoid, I'm not.
No, I have not heard of Richard Hofstadter, but I will look at this essay you refer to. I think, and I again am amongst experts, and I am no expert. I do think that there is a population whose paranoia may be increased by their own vulnerability. And I think that's one of the things that those of us who live with privilege and who are not vulnerable have to understand what it must feel like. And so even though I would disagree with a lot of the sort of vitriol I hear coming out of people about people, particularly working class whites, about making America great again, or I want my country back, et cetera. Some of that is the sense of vulnerability that they feel, that their economic prospects have been diminished, that things that they presumed to be are no longer, and that their understanding of our system of fairness has been turned on its head. And I believe that again, I'm not an expert, but I believe that can contribute to an even heightened sense of paranoia. And so we have to, that inequality, which is the root of that they're feeling, the worker in Macomb County outside of Detroit who no longer has a job, who 10,000 people in that one county, Tip, Michigan. I mean, I'm just saying. I mean, these are not huge numbers of people, and yet I don't believe, have fully come to understand just how they feel. And I think that the kind of empathy part of my brain, even though I don't agree with, I absolutely can sense a genuine sense of feeling left out and left behind, and that I can relate to.
I think we are going to, since we are on a tight schedule, to the next event. So we would like to thank you very much, Darren, for doing it.